Hi, I'm Sue Weston, educator here at the Torrington Historical Society, and today I'll be sharing a story of the very first project that I worked on when I came here as a volunteer, which was to clean and archive a box of glass plate negatives that had been donated to us. I'll tell you a little bit about our donor and how the project came to the Historical Society, provide a little bit of insight into what goes on behind the scenes with the collection items that we receive, and share some of the clues that I found along the way in the photos and the Historical Society resources that helped us to identify some of the people and our photographer. And also share why donations such as these are so important to the Historical Society. All of the black and white images that you see in the presentation today are from the box that I worked with. This image of a house and a young man with a camera was my introduction to the project. Mark sent me this photo and explained they had received a donation of glass plate negatives that needed to be cleaned. Some of the plates had been identified as being from Torrington, but our executive director and curator really wanted to find out more about the contents of the box and the relationship to Torrington. Before I go a little bit further, I'll explain a little bit about the glass plate negative process. So glass plate negatives were really popular in the later 1800s and early 1900s, and it's basically just a negative captured on a piece of glass. Our particular ones were on a 4x5 piece of glass. They do come in different sizes. Our photographer was using a dry plate negative process, which made it easier to take photos, so he could go into a store and actually purchase a box of glass plates with the emulsion that captured the image already on it. The old wet plate process required a lot more work with chemicals to take the photo. And in our box of negatives, the photographer didn't have to place a dark curtain over his head and make everyone stay still for 5 minutes and take the negatives to a dark tent to actually produce the image. So his method was considered easy. To us now with our cell phone cameras, it seems like a rather cumbersome process. He would have used a large box camera, a little bit bigger than a shoebox, and would have to carry around a box or several boxes of glass plate negatives. Each of the small boxes held about 12 glass plates, so if you ran out of plates, there weren't any more photographs that day. So one side had an emulsion on it that, when exposed to the light, would capture the photo image, and our photographer would take the glass plate negatives home and develop his or own prints. And one of the hallmarks is their clarity and definition, as you can see from this photo here, all the various grayscales and the real crispness and clarity. And after seeing this one image, I couldn't wait to get started. So let me tell you a little bit about our donor and how the box came to the Historical Society. I'm actually really pleased to say our donor is actually in the audience tonight, Sally Johnson. She lives up in Vermont, and Sally had reached out to the Historical Society several years ago and explained that a few decades earlier she'd purchased a collection of glass plate negatives in an estate sale as she was traveling around New England. And she had them stored in her home and had a few images that she'd made into photographs over the years and thought they were really interesting and should be preserved. But many years later, Sally revisited the box and noticed several slide boxes that were marked with H.W. Fleig, which many of you may remember as Fleig and Newberry. They sold stationery and photo supplies up on Water Street in the 1800s and later moved to East Main Street. Sally had a hunch that the group of approximately 400 negatives might be connected to Torrington in other ways as well, and reached out to the Historical Society to offer up the box as a donation. However, the museum doesn't normally accept things sight unseen, so our director and curator, Mark and Gail, drove up to Vermont to study the negatives more closely, and after spending an afternoon holding up the negatives to the light, it was evident there were certainly images of Torrington in the box, and they graciously accepted the donation from Sally and brought the box back to the Historical Society for more investigation. Although the slide box had the Torrington labels and there were some Torrington images in it, we really weren't sure at this point if the photographer was a Torrington resident or if they had simply come through town and taken images of Torrington on their way through. The next clue was also found on a slide box. You can see here in that scripty writing up on top, it says Views SHJ. So we were wondering if these were the initials of the photographer, but had to do a little bit more investigating. Using an early 1900s Torrington City Directory, which is a resource we have here at the library, this catalogs every resident by year and every business in town by year. So it's a fabulous resource for us to use. And there was only one person whose name matched those initials, Sidney H. Jennings. And you can see here, right under Ralph Jennings, that you can see there in bold, SHJ worked at Hendy Machine Company. And we weren't sure if this was our photographer, but it certainly was an encouraging clue. So Mark wrote down Sidney's name on a little piece of paper, and I took that home to search for more information. So who was Sidney H. Jennings? That night I went onto Ancestry and did a little bit of research to see what I could find out and help with my search. And found out that SHJ was actually Sidney Herbert Jennings, that he immigrated to Torrington from England around 1896 when he was about 31 years old, and he worked as a machinist for the Hendy Machine Company all of his life. So knowing that he lived in Torrington for so long and then seeing this photo of a Hendy machine from the slides, we felt pretty confident that we knew who our photographer was. So we don't know if this image of a Hendy milling machine was one that he took for fun or if it was used by the Hendy Company for a promotion. You can see that there's that curtain in back to block the distractions of the factory. And you can see the pride that Sidney took in his work and the staging that he did around the base of the machine, lining up all of his tools. Sidney married Fanny Jackaway, who was born in Vermont, which is perhaps why our donor found the box up in that area. It may have gone to one of Fanny's relatives, and that's how it came to be up in Vermont. But through Ancestry, I also found out that Fanny was a school teacher for many years at several schools in town, one being the Old Wood South School, which is shown here about where the Armory and Dunkin' Donuts is now on South Main Street, and also at the later school on South Main Street about where Garden View Apartments is now. So as a historian, I can't confirm that this is Fanny's class, but I'd like to think that it is. And Fanny and Sidney lived in town in a number of places, first renting and eventually purchasing a home on McKinley Street, where they lived for their entire lives. They had 3 children, and that was what I was able to find out through Ancestry. So let's step away from the Jennings family just a moment so I can explain a little bit about the process of cleaning, scanning, and archiving the slides. So I had a really large carton of glass plate negatives, and inside of that carton were a number of original dry plate slide boxes with about 12 slides in each box. And there was also a number of just loose slides that were sitting in the box on their own. Each negative has a smooth side and a rough side. The rough side is the side that has the emulsion on it that captures the image. So the emulsion side I had to clean with a light dusting of a fine paintbrush just to get all the dust off it. The smooth side I had a small cotton pad and some distilled water, and I'd clean that off and then dry it so that it would be clear once we scanned the image. And I had a slide box, which you can see here in the background, and once I'd cleaned an image, I'd place it up on the slide box to determine which images would get scanned. At the beginning, I was only scanning Torrington images. I'd be excited, I see Coe Park or the library, and other times I just see a bunch of people, which at the beginning we couldn't identify. But as I started to go through it, we ended up scanning all of the images once we realized that they were actually Torrington images. So once they were scanned, I'd assign a title to the image and use that title on the archival envelope and also on the digital copy that I had scanned in so that they would match. So they're really easy to find. If I wanted to go find the library, I could find the actual slide image and I could actually find the digital image. And each of the negatives, once they were cleaned, got put into their own envelope in a padded archival box so that they're safe and able to be located in the future. And you can see what that looks like here. As I was cleaning all these slides, my biggest concern is that I was going to break one of the images. So let's go back to discovering the clues that I saw in the photos. So as I was cleaning more and more of the negatives, more information emerged. So when I found this image, I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know what it was. I obviously knew it was a church, but I didn't know which one. But it's the Old Wood Episcopal Church here on the corner of Prospect Street and Water Street. So this is the photo that helped me to date the slides. We knew the building was moved further back on the property in 1898 to make room for the church that we know now. So I knew the photos were at least as early as 1898, which is 2 years after Sidney arrived in the United States. So I know now that the photos were probably taken soon after he arrived, and at least by 1898. So there was one of my dating clues. This next image here was another photo that gave me some dating clues. This image actually has 1909 inscribed right into it, which helped me to realize that the people I thought might be Mr. and Mrs. Jennings and her children couldn't be, because it just didn't match up with the ages of the children. But one of the things that I love about this photo is that I actually get to see our photographer. So if you look at the shadow on the ground, you can see the shadow of his hat and his camera box. And because my photographer's always taking the picture, I don't know if he's handed his camera to someone else to take the picture. So this is my photo that I have of our photographer. It was this photo of Charlotte Hungerford Hospital that gave me another dating clue. So Charlotte Hungerford Hospital was founded in 1916 by Uri Hungerford in honor of his mother, Charlotte, who was involved in a number of charitable organizations throughout her life. And he really wanted to pay homage to her. So the property was designed by Olmsted Brothers, the famous landscape architectural firm who was known for their curvilinear lines. And you can tell, any of you who have ever gone to the hospital and driven up that curvy driveway there, that was one of the hallmarks that Olmsted was known for, their sweeping views and grounds and that curvilinear lines. So this was really a state-of-the-art facility at the time and would have been very important to the town, and certainly would have been a place that Sidney would have driven to and taken a photograph of. So I know at this point now, because of the early photos that we have from 1898 and then this photo that was 1916, that my photos span at least about 20 years and perhaps a little bit longer. So that was some of the dating clues that I found. Since the beginning of this project, I became so obsessed with finding out who the people and places in the photos were. In my spare time, I was driving around Torrington with my mom and dad in the car with a pile of printed out images and addresses where the Jennings lived over the years or where other Jennings family lived, thinking I might be able to find some linkages between the actual photo and help to identify them. So I met a number of people that were really curious about why I was taking pictures of their homes or looking at their home or apartment building. And some people were very interested and some people were very nervous until I explained what it was that I was doing. But I have to say, I came up with a lot of dead ends. And I finally realized that Sidney wasn't taking photos of where he lived, but only of other buildings that he either found interesting or perhaps where people lived that he knew. So as this was going on, everyone in the office was getting interested and became involved in trying to solve the puzzle, and it truly became a group effort. Blair, one of our Torrington Historical Society employees, saw one of the photos that I cleaned one day, this image that you see here on the left-hand side, and said, "I think I know where that house is." So on his way home from work that day, he stopped to take the photo that you see here on the right. It was up on Highland Avenue, and he solved one of the clues. There was a Jennings family member that lived up on Highland Avenue, but because it was so early in time, the Sanborn map and the Torrington City directories don't actually give a house number, so I can't confirm it was that family member or if it was a friend's house, but we do know that the grouping that you see of the family below was taken on the front steps of this house. So another clue solved, but I still had a lot more to figure out. And as I kept cleaning and scanning and looked for more clues. This woman that you see here, I kept seeing repeatedly as I was cleaning the slide. She was in over 70 of the 350 photos. And at the beginning, I thought perhaps it was Mrs. Jennings, and she was also seen a lot with two young girls. But the dates just didn't make sense, so I started to call her Binocular Woman because she had this pair of binoculars in her hand. And all the people that I kept seeing over and over again got names. I had Bowler Hat Man, Cat Lady, Locket Lady, as Without their real names, I had no way to identify them. So that kind of helped me link them together, the photos and the people. I really wanted to find out their real names, but it really took me months and months to resolve who this individual woman was. I also loved that in this photo that we have the photographer's camera box in the photo. It's right here next to the carriage. It also drove me crazy. What was on that rock? I don't know what the writing is on that rock. I wasn't able to figure it out. And if anybody has any clues, I would love to know. I had to go back to my clues. We all loved this image of the birthday party. First, because you can see how a birthday party was celebrated at the turn of the century. The children were all dressed up. There's those flowers in the pictures, fruit, apples, bananas. There's cookies in the background. And the children are all just dressed up so beautifully. You can tell they're just having a great time. But what I really loved in this photo is the railroad car and the homes in the background. Because they gave me some clues. So when I found several other photos of what you'll see in the next slide, you'll see these homes a little bit closer here in the railroad tracks. And I knew that this was taken from upstairs of a house looking out into a backyard. And I assumed it was the same house as the birthday party. So when I saw this slide, I thought that's where the birthday party was taken. This close-up of the same image gives us a really clear view of those unique little brackets that you see, the little architectural piece up in the gable. And that also gave me another clue. So I had to go back to the research materials, and this time using a Sanborn map, which was originally used for insurance purposes and shows the placement of houses on the street and their outbuildings. So Mark and I pulled the maps out and started to trace the railroad tracks and found these homes along Lewis Street. So if you look at the top of the page, that is New Litchfield Street, and then you can see the railroad tracks just below that running through diagonally, horizontally across the page. And then the street just behind that is Lewis Street. So I knew that those homes were along Lewis Street, looking out from the homes on New Litchfield Street. So when I left that day, I told all my colleagues in the office I was going to go walk down the railroad tracks and find out where this house was, which caused a little bit of concern for my colleagues. But I really didn't need to do that because all I needed to do was pull into the parking lot at White Flower Farm off of Earl Street. And sure enough, there were the railroad tracks and the homes with the unique little gables. With the architectural piece, same as in the early 1900s. Some of them still exist there. But I still didn't know exactly which house it was on New Litchfield Street the photos were taken from, nor the names of the people that lived there. So again, a little bit more investigation needed to get done. It was this photo that actually helped to solve the mystery. There were a number of photos of the young girls under a Christmas tree that I kept seeing over and over again over various years. And I was fascinated by two things: what was on the tree, which could be anything from a Christmas ornament to a stream of paper to shoes to socks to different gifts. And I was also interested in what was under the tree, which you can see here. There's dolls and a cigar box Indian. There's some books, there's some perfumes, and you can see that there's two mugs on some floral containers. And what I noticed is that there was some initials on those mugs. And if you look at it closely, one looks like Gertruda and the other one looked like E and an S. So I thought it might be Gertrude. I wasn't quite sure about the second one. So I went back to Ancestry to the 1910 census that night and went through looking for a name that might match these. And I finally found Albert Main and his wife Louisa and their two children, Gertrude and Esther. They lived on New Litchfield Street, and early in Albert's career, he also worked at Hendy Machine Company before moving on to Borgeson. And I assume that Sidney became friends with Albert when they worked at Hendy, and their families spent a lot of time together. You can tell from all of the photographs. And before he was married and after he was married. So Binocular Woman and Bowler Hat Man finally had names, Albert and Louisa, although it took months and months to actually figure that out. But finding the name to this family gave me a lot of clues to other photos that we had in the collection. Thinking that researching the families of Albert and Louisa Main might help to identify others in the photos, as some of the people in the images look like they might be grandparents or aunts and uncles, I was really stretching the research a bit wide in the hopes that something might work. And I found that Louisa's parents, the Smiths, also immigrated from England and lived up on Hillside Avenue off of East Main Street. And I had also been doing some research on a person named Jeremiah Jennings, who I wasn't sure if he was related to Sidney, but he worked at Hotchkiss Brothers, and I was hoping I could link him to Sidney and give me some additional clues. Jeremiah Jennings' wife's family, the Grants, also lived up on Hillside. So I had to take a family drive up to Hillside Avenue, and unfortunately, Louisa's family's home is no longer there. It's been replaced by a brick building. But the Grant family home was, and this is the Grant home. So once I was on Hillside, I realized I had more than just the Grant home clue, as both the Grant home and the Smith home looked down over the city, which led me to this next photo. As I was up on Hillside, I knew that this was looking down over the city. That hill looked down over the city. And probably pretty close to here is where this panorama was taken. This is actually two images that some of you might have seen in the Through the Lens exhibit in 2019. And we realized at the time we were putting that exhibit together that these two photos actually went together as a panorama. And this is the pond that you see over on the left-hand side is the old East Branch Pond where Willow Garden Apartments is now. And I think this is Maud Street coming in at a right angle there, and Farnham Street is the one coming down parallel to East Main Street. And then I'm going to show you the detail here. In the detail on the right-hand side, you can really see that the area is still quite undeveloped. In the distance, you can see Highland Avenue going up the hill. And down in the center left, you can see the Congregational Church and St. Francis steeples. And a lot of chicken coops and a lot of outhouses. Excelsior Needle is on the far right, and then Center Cemetery with the carriage house of our building is right in the center of this. So slowly I was figuring it out, and we were really excited that the carriage house where we would be sitting tonight, if we weren't in COVID doing this by Zoom, you would be listening to this in person in that carriage house, which we had in this photo that Sidney took. Another reason why researching the Main family was so important is I started to figure out other houses in the neighborhood. Sidney was taking photos of neighbors around New Litchfield Street. This is the house on the corner of New Litchfield Street in Albert, which this one was actually pretty easy to figure out because of that big house that you can see back in the distance. It's pretty distinctive and easy to recognize. This image right here was another image associated with the Main family. When I saw this building in the back, it helped to identify where it was. The S is the end of Perkins Electric, which was up on Forest Street. So another drive took me up in that neighborhood, and I was able to find that there were several homes there that had this kind of design up on Munson Avenue. And later in the box, I found an image of a grave with Orlo Main's name on it, and he lived on Munson Street. So another Main family member and another Main family connection that lived up there that Sidney had gone to their home and taken this picture of this man, and there's a baby carriage out there in front. So the Main family research really helped me to resolve a number of clues in the photos, but as I continued to clean the images, I was also able to learn a little bit more about our photographer Sidney and what interested him in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And in looking at this photo and certainly many of the other ones, I learned that Sidney had a really good eye for composition. If you think about how he had to take these images, carrying around his large, bulky camera and carrying around the boxes of glass plate negatives, again, no easy feat compared to the ease we have today with our phones. Because of this, many of the images are staged, and he posed children and animals and his friends to get really interesting shot. And I loved his sense of composition in this particular image. He has that rectangular block formed by the rock in the back. He's got the diagonal formed by the mother, this is actually Louisa, and the two younger children, the white dresses, are her children. In the diagonal going down, he's got that little hat off in the trees in the background, and a picnic basket, and one of the baby's actually holding a religious tract in her hand. He's got the little doll set on Louisa's skirt. So he took his time in composing this and putting it together, and it's really a lovely composition. One of the subjects he loved was children. Whether they were candid or posed, he really did take a lot of pictures of children. And it was really difficult for me to decide which ones to share with you because they were just so lovely. He really enjoyed this subject matter and took a lot of photos of the main children as well as other children that were in the community. I love this little boy with all of his toys here. You can really get a good idea of what some of the toys were that kids had in the early 1900s. So that was one of our favorites. He also was great with the animals. His dog photos show a really great sense of humor, although I did worry a little bit about this poor dog sitting on this table over on the left-hand side. I think it was okay. But the guy on the left here, he created a whole still life just using the dog as part of the display. And you can see he's got the table with the diagonal of the tablecloth coming down right behind the dog. There's a big column in the back. He's got a pillow set up, the dog's sitting on pillows, an oriental carpet or some sort of carpet that's on the ground underneath him. And then he has a bowl of apples, almost like this is a Cezanne image that he's putting together with his camera. I just loved his thoughtfulness and his sense of humor in taking the photo. You can also see his sense of humor here in these two photos. In the early days of researching Sidney, I noted that I'd mentioned earlier that there was that other Jennings that worked at Hotchkiss Brothers, Jeremiah. And my dad worked at Hotchkiss Brothers, so I was really trying to figure out, was Jeremiah a relative of Sidney's, which I still haven't been able to prove 100%, but I'm fairly certain that they were. I'm just not exactly sure what the relationship was. And when I saw this image, it seemed like it was Hotchkiss Brothers to me. I spent a lot of hours there when I was a kid wandering around after my dad. And we actually had someone else this week comment on our Facebook page that they thought that this was the inside of Hotchkiss Brothers. But I loved how playful these images are. You've got the guys with their pipe and a cigar inside a wood shop, all dressed up to go to work in their striped shirts and their bow ties. Really fabulous images. And although there were a lot of clues in the photos, this is one I just couldn't figure out. I always wished that I had more. And this one just can't be explained. I have no idea what was going on here with this man astride this enormous stag head. I would love to know more about him. I can tell it was taken in a studio and can really see the playfulness and careful staging of the composition, but I have no idea what it was. But it was one that I wanted to share with all of you just because it was so different. Another thing we were able to tell about Sidney is really his pride that he took in his neighborhood and the broader Torrington community, both the neighbors and friends that were around him, and the many landmarks and developments that were going on around town as he was living here, which there were many during this 20-year time period, or 20 years or so time period. One of the things he liked to take pictures of were homes, and we're not sure if he was paid to take pictures of these homes or if it just happened to be friends or families that he knew that he liked the way the architecture looked. The way I figured out where this one was because there was a name, Hohensee, on the side of a slide box that he had scrawled on there. And the Hohensees, through the Torrington City Director, we found lived up on Hoffman Street. And driving up there, we were able to find this house, which looks very much the way that it did back in the early 1900s. So again, another clue resolved, but there's still many, many pictures of homes we don't know. We might start to share some of those with you on Facebook to see if we can find out who they belong to. So again, as we've said, we know that Sidney's really proud of where he lived and the neighborhood and the city that's developing around him as he's living here. And we saw the earlier picture of Charlotte Hungerford Hospital. We know he was attracted to that site. And this site here is of Coe Park. which took us a little bit of time to figure out that it was actually Coe Park. We weren't really certain because it was established in 1906, and since then the land that's around it, the sidewalks, the lamppost, everything's changed. So it was a little bit hard to figure out. Coe Park was given to the town by the Coe children in memory of their parents, and the Coe home would have been to the right of this photo. And one of the stipulations for the bequest was to eliminate the house, number one, but to also eliminate Elm Street, which ran down the center of this area, and they asked to create a pathway as part of the park. So Mark went back to the Sanborn maps again and confirmed that this path would have been the road where the elm trees were lining the path, and Cook Funeral Home today would have been off to the left-hand side. And Carol, our archivist, also found a postcard with an image of the lamppost that you see in the little insert that's there, that unusual little curved lamppost decoration at the top. And she found a postcard with that was just barely visible that allowed us to confirm that, yes, this was an early photo of the Coe Park. And that is Albert Main that we see walking in the background on Coe Park, enjoying that elm-lined pathway. Hillside Cemetery was another Olmsted-designed property that was being developed at the time. It was opened in 1909 as Center Cemetery was reaching its maximum capacity. So several businessmen in town got together, and after a nice donation from Mrs. Midgen, created the Hillside Cemetery Association. The association hired Olmsted Brothers, and construction on this English Gothic style Alvord Chapel was begun in 1913 and dedicated in 1916. So Sidney went up to this location and took a number of photos. There are actually some images that we wonder are when the cemetery was being developed. It looks like that, although it's really hard to confirm it. But we also have some of the really early graves. And you can see here, again, that curvilinear Olmsted design, similar to what's up at the hospital. There's not a straight sidewalk. There's not a straight street. Everything is curvilinear. And again, that was what the Olmsted design firm was known for. And Sidney was certainly attracted to this. Another item of interest for Sidney during this time period was the Torrington Library. And you can see that Coe Park, he's taking this from Coe Park. The library was dedicated in 1901. So when he took this photo, it was either brand new or fairly new when he took the photo. And certainly a building that impressed him enough to set up his camera and take the photo. He took a couple different images of the library, one where you can see the window on the side a little bit more. But this was nice because you can see what Coe Park looked like at the time. Another destination that was popular during this time period was Murphy Park, and Sidney took several pictures of this during this time frame. And although it was on land that's actually in Harwington, many people just considered it a part of Torrington at that time. Honestly, it's down on South Main Street off of Bogue Road where the dog pound is and the water recycling plant. And I think people still think it's Torrington, but it actually is on land in Harwington. It was built in 1899 and continued in operation in various forms until the 1920s. But at the time that this was built, it was a big deal in town. The newspaper account said that both South Main Street and the road coming down from Litchfield was crammed with carriages. The grandstand was seated 7,000 people. That horse stable that you see in the background there, the white building, was actually oval shaped, and it had horse stables for 40 horses. And there was a clubhouse in the center of that building that you see there where various events were held over the year. And although this was started by a guy who was a bit of a shyster, he got in some trouble a few years later for some various other business things that he was proposing. At the beginning, this was a very popular place for people to go. There was no drinking and no gambling allowed. They really wanted it to be a place where everyone of every class could go and enjoy themselves and have a respectable day. And Sidney traveled here to photograph it for us to view. It wasn't just the center of town that interested Sidney as he was out taking photographs. This scene of the dam on Nickel Mine Brook was a popular spot for people to go to at the time and enjoy a bit of nature. He also took images of families visiting a lake. I think it's probably Bantam Lake, although it could also be Highland. There's snow scenes with sleighs and various other outings. And although I've focused primarily on downtown Torrington today, Sidney also traveled outside of Torrington. There's a Civil War monument that he took a photo of in Bridgeport, several images of Brooklyn and the Brooklyn Naval Yard, and also New York City. So he did travel outside of Torrington taking photographs. There was really a diversity of subjects that interested him. I hope that in viewing this selection of photographs, you can see that the proverb about a picture being worth 1,000 words was certainly true for our box of glass plate negatives. I have to thank our donor, Sally Johnson, for her good judgment in purchasing the negatives, caring for them, and donating them to the museum. After more than 100 years, it's really remarkable that these fragile glass plate negatives found their way back to Torrington intact. And her efforts in preserving them are important in a number of ways. It's really made it possible for us to commemorate the life and photography of Sidney Herbert Jennings, who worked by day at Hendy Machine and in his spare time took so many beautiful images of the city that he lived and worked in and the many people who were a part of his life. Especially understanding that he was using a really cumbersome camera and carrying around slide boxes. Really remarkable. And it allowed us to view Torrington as it was in the late 19th and early 20th century, as seen specifically through Sidney's eyes, with pride, a sense of humor, and the artistry that comes through in all the photos. The donations also revealed some aspects of Torrington history that we didn't have. The Elm Street view in Coe Park, the panorama, and many of the homes which were so beautifully depicted and many in Torrington are working so hard to preserve. This house image is also one of those images that we wouldn't have if not for this collection. When I saw this grand house, I had no idea where it was, but neither did anybody else in the museum. Based on the buildings around it, Mark thought that perhaps it might be located on Prospect Street, and our archivist Carol was able to find an image showing just a section of the house with the turret and a postcard, so we were able to identify it as the Arthur Morse house. He was a draftsman at Coe Brass. But unfortunately, the house was torn down. It's where the current St. John Paul the Great Academy is now, but it was torn down a number of years ago. And we really love it as it's the only image of that house that we have. So we're really thankful that we're able to see the whole image. We're also very fortunate because of the way donation also enhances the way in which we can share history with others. Several of these images, as you know, were used in our Through the Lens photography show in 2019, and the birthday party image was used on the cover of our annual report. And I'm currently working on a presentation for 3rd and 4th grade students, and several of those images will get used in that presentation as well. And I'm sure that these images will get used in other ways in the future to illustrate the life at the turn of the century in Torrington. They really are a fabulous resource. I'm going to end with this photo. This photo haunts me a little bit. It's really hard not to know what my photographer looks like, especially after all this time spent with his photographs. And I really wish I could see into this photo in about 5 minutes, as I'm fairly certain that Sidney would have packed up his photography equipment and climbed back into this carriage with, I know that it's Louisa and Albert Maine in the back. And then the woman that's sitting closest to us, I think might be his wife, although I can't be positive of that. Certainly it's a family friend because she is in many of the photos. So I think that it's his wife. But he would have climbed back into this photograph, and I would have gotten a chance to see what he looked like. Thanks to one of you, I know that this photo was taken at White Memorial Foundation in Litchfield. I love that this carriage drove all the way up from Torrington into Litchfield to see White Memorial Foundation at that point, and I would love to see what he was looked like as he was doing his work. So I hope that you have enjoyed seeing how a box of glass plate negatives became such a wonderful resource to the Historical Society, and that you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about the work that goes on behind the scenes, And as you obviously can tell, I got really attached to this project and felt it was really important to follow the clues to find out who the people were in the photos and to give them a little teeny place in history. There's still a lot more clues to follow up on and mysteries to be solved. And in my spare time, I'm still researching the clues and driving around Torrington, working on uncovering more about our photos. So this story doesn't end here, but our program for today does. And I really thank you for listening. And uh, I'll be sharing more information with you on the progress of our search as we go through this in the future. Thank you so much. Good night.